Let me turn on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Then we will go through the exercise on iNaturalist, which was to upload pictures of insects, which hopefully you've done through the week, followed by the hands-on session of working on Shaktival, the document. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Okay. I think the main attraction of the seminar was how do you build ecologically aware design? How can urban community settings be more ecologically aware? And I don't think I can give you straight answers to that, but we can explore some of the ideas here and see how we can make our way towards it. The first point is that it cannot be modular. You cannot have a building and then have a terrace garden and hope that this is more ecologically aware. Ecologically aware design has to be built from the ground up. But how does one go about doing it then? And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have some idea. But let's begin with the question of why do you need a functional ecosystem? What does a functional ecosystem give you? So a pitch for functional ecosystems. 3 examples which I will give you. The first one is of wolves and caribou. The Arctic is, the poles are where we have large snow sheets. And these sheets of snow and ice reflect solar radiation and help keep the earth much cooler than it would be if they weren't there. And caribou are these reindeer which live in these landscapes, and left to themselves, they would break snow cover, so to speak. But we have wolves that keep these herds moving and so help ensure that these snow sheets are intact. So a functional ecosystem here is the caribou along with the wolves, making sure that the earth stays cooler. Another great example of complicated ecosystems are the salmon runs that happen in Northwest America. So salmon are these fish which live most of their life in the open ocean, but when they have to spawn, which is lay eggs, they swim upstream along rivers to the places where they themselves were born. And swimming upstream, they bring nutrients from the ocean back into terrestrial ecosystems. And by becoming food for bears and eventually bringing the nutrition back into the soil and into the forest, complete a cycle of nutrients that is indispensable. And finally, we have porous soils. So even a grassland that looks like it doesn't have many plants has grasses which have really deep roots. And these roots, along with all the insects that live in the soil, keep the soil porous and functional, so to speak. And so these soils can absorb large amounts of water. And no matter how much it rains, there will not be a flood on a large, vast, open grassland, unless a river, of course, is overflowing its banks. But what happens if an ecosystem is dysfunctional? Like, why am I talking about functional ecosystems? So this is an example of what happens if an ecosystem goes dysfunctional. You have an urban setting where the water is not seeping back into the soil and you have flooding. We're often faced with these problems and we start to think of the solution starting from the problem. Like, we have an urban setting, we have flooding. Now, how do we deal with it? But an ecological way of thinking about this is to take a step back and say, what went wrong? Like, why is this ecosystem dysfunctional? And how can we bring it closer to its functional state? I think that is an ecological way of thinking about it. That's like the first point that I wanted to make. The second is that we cannot tell if an ecosystem is functional or not. Like, it takes a lot of experience to tell that. So how then can we start to look at functional ecosystems? And I think biodiversity is a great heuristic. It's a great rule of thumb, so to speak, which gives us an insight into functional ecosystems. So a system that has more biodiversity is more functional. When scientists first came, how scientists first came across this idea is that they were monitoring grass plots, and they realized that plots that had more species in them were more resilient to drought and could come back more easily from fires or from flooding and could maintain their diversity. But this is true for almost every ecosystem that you can think of. It's true for large forests that are more diverse, are more resilient. It is true for soil communities, soils which have more and a more complex and more diverse set of insects are better soils. And it's true of the human gut. The human gut is full of bacteria, and guts that have a more diverse biome, a microbiome, are more resilient to disease. Throats that are more biodiverse in their microbiome are more resilient to getting an infection. So this is from the reading I Contain Multitudes, which kind of encapsulates what I've been just saying, which is that all zoology is really ecology. All the concepts that ecologists use to describe, I'll just have to move this up there. Yeah. The continental scale ecosystems that we see through satellites also apply to ecosystems in our bodies that we peer at with microscopes. We can compare the gut of a person with inflammatory bowel disease to a dying coral reef or a fallow field. A battered ecosystem where the balance of organisms has gone awry. And one way of a heuristic for this, of course, is biodiversity. So the less diverse a place is, the more prone it is to getting infested, invaded, or an infection. Another thing that biodiversity does, so the first is that it's a great heuristic for functional ecosystems. But another thing it's really good at, and I hope you got a sense of that when you were doing the INAT exercise. The INAT exercise was to upload pictures of insects. And to do that, you have to find insects, like where do you see insects? And where life thrives is where functional ecosystems are, right? So you'll have to go out into a park, or even better, go out into a forest. And there you will see more life. Why this is good for us, like why places where life thrives are good for us, is because a hint to that is the canary in the coal mine. When people would mine for coal, these underground shafts were prone to getting flooded with carbon monoxide, which is an odorless gas. And you couldn't tell its presence, but it is deadly. It would kill you. So they would take a canary with them. And if the canary is more sensitive to it than humans are, and if the canary died, they would know that there's carbon monoxide and they need to get out. And this works because we have the same systems that a canary has. We are linked in ways that are deep biologically, and that is through evolution. Dobzhansky famously said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. If there is one concept in ecology that you should know, I think it's evolution. So I'll just take a minute to explain the basics of how all life is linked. The process of evolution is called speciation, which is how species are formed. I think this understanding speciation is like central to understanding evolution. And the example I will use is of languages. So if you think of all the trees, all the dark green trees on the left as one language, a population that speaks one language. And if the population was to then get separated by a barrier and they could not talk to each other again, they would over time accumulate changes which would lead these two languages down very separate paths. If you can imagine this happening, you will know that dialects arise this way. And given enough time, These dialects would accumulate changes that would make them different enough for each other to be mutually unintelligible, which is to say they would become two different languages. So this happens in the natural world as well, and this is how species are formed. And we call this speciation. And this is the process of evolution. This is how the engine of evolution basically. And this, I'm sure some of you have seen this before, is the tree of life. If you can see my cursor, can you see my cursor, Rajesh?
I can't. Oh, now I can. Yeah, when you move it, I can.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the origin of life, right? This is where life originated. And then it branches out through speciation into all these different life forms. Each dead end is a life form that went extinct. Each of these lines is a mass extinction event. So each mass extinction event coincides with a number of dead ends, which is a lot of organisms going extinct. And you eventually get this tree, which is all living organisms today. A very brief point about the origin of life is that life originated once. This is, to me, quite mind-blowing. It happened once and it hasn't happened again. And we're not entirely sure yet how or where it happened, but we think it happened in hydrothermal vents where there are these chemical soups getting treated with really high temperatures. And in these hydrothermal vents, molecules got arranged in certain ways and were somehow able to maintain their complexity over time. They were able to take in nutrients from their surroundings and use this energy to maintain their complexity, which is what life basically is. We are able to maintain our own complexity using energy from the environment. Just that brief note, and coming back to this tree of life. So life originated once, and we have all of this. This diagram is actually from a really cool website. I will try and show it to you just now. Here. And if you take a screenshot or if you just remember this or take a note of this, you can point out any two organisms on this tree of life, and it gives you their common ancestor, which is what organism eventually led to these two organisms arising. So if you take a fish and you take a mammal, you get a common ancestor that looked something like this and lived 415 million years ago. So this, I think, brings home beautifully how all life is linked. And so if you can make a place where birds thrive, it would also be a place where man can thrive. And if you make a place where birds die, it's not the best place for man to live, basically. That's the point. You can explore the tree later as well. It's a really cool resource. One thing that this tree gets wrong, however, is the sheer mass or the number of organisms living today. So this is a very stylized tree. This tree is closer to reality. It's from 2013 and captures the diversity slightly better. So in this tree, you see the bacteria are here, and then there's plants, and then all vertebrates are basically just here, just this 8 o'clock section. All vertebrates, which means all mammals, birds, reptiles, everything. And then the rest, insects are here on this part. But this also is outdated. And a later tree of life, this is from 2017, shows, so this bottom right here, Opisthoconnta, basically is where all, this corner basically is where all multicellular organisms are. So you have this large section which is just bacteria. Then you have archaea, which used to be called archaebacteria, but are now called archaea. And so you realize that large life forms, as we know them, are actually very few in number. And even the life forms that we do know of, that we see, that we can see with our eyes, butterflies, for instance, or insects, or nematodes, which are worms that live in the soil, the dark part of these circles are undescribed species, which is species that are out there but have not been described by science yet. We don't even know where to look for them or how to look for them, or if we've seen them yet. So much of life is undescribed or unknown to us. And it also shows that so much of functionality is unknown to us. We don't even know what role they're playing in these ecosystems or how they're making these ecosystems more resilient, or we don't know anything about them. So what does that tell us? It tells us to stay humble. So this is a forest ecosystem. It's really complex, and we are only just beginning to understand these systems. So if there is one takeaway from this section of the talk, it is that we cannot even imagine recreating these ecosystems. If you think you can recreate a viable forest ecosystem all over again, it is impossible because we do not understand it. It's a machinery that you once taken apart cannot be put back. So if you were to design urban systems, it's best to somehow fit them within functional ecosystems and keep those systems intact rather than start from scratch and rebuild them. And to give you an example, this is one of my favorite model systems. So these birds are hornbills. India has 9 species of hornbills. This particular hornbill, called the wreathed hornbill, lives in the northeast of India. And they are fruit eaters. They can eat really large fruits. They swallow the fruit whole. The fruit gets digested, and then they regurgitate the seed intact. And because they have these large beaks, they can swallow really large fruits. And also they can disperse these seeds far and wide. So when we were working in these forests, the impression a lot of people have, and this somebody told me, and the metaphor just stuck with me, is that they've always assumed that forest grows on the soil like hair on the scalp. And once we explained to him, or we discussed how dispersal is such an important part of forest coming back. We realized that these birds are basically the gardeners of the forest. And if there wasn't enough seed dispersal, the forest would actually not come back. And the cool thing with these birds is they disperse the seeds of the fruits that they like most because they eat those fruits more. So given enough time, they will convert the forest into a food orchard, into a food forest for themselves, because they're the most dominant frugivores, most dominant seed dispersers. And the first reading that we'd sent out about human societies on islands, and there were these 2 examples of humans on islands. One of them was a 7 square kilometer island, which was quite denuded after humans had been living on it for a couple of thousands of years. But there is an island in India called Narcondam, which is 7 square kilometers and is uninhabited, but has a species of hornbills that lives on it. And they've been there for a couple of thousands of years. And what they have done with the island is just phenomenal. It is a food orchard with a very high density of fig trees, which is their favorite fruit, and which is also one of the keystone species in any forest. And if I have enough time towards the end of the talk, I will tell you more about figs. But this is one great functional ecosystem that I can think of. Another heuristic, the first one that I had said was biodiversity. Another heuristic, because it's so hard for us to know a functional ecosystem when we see one. So another rule of thumb to speak of is if you have a top predator in the ecosystem, then it is a functional ecosystem. Because for a leopard to survive in any landscape, it needs enough prey base, enough deer. And for enough deer to be there, they need enough food. And so the ecosystem is in place. This also applies to, say, a mangrove forest. There is a move now to bring in the mangroves to protect coastal regions from cyclones. But we must understand that as true as it is for urban systems, that you cannot have modular inputs, it's also true for wider ecosystems. Just bringing back the mangrove trees is not bringing back the mangroves. You will have to bring in the associated species, and the top predator in mangrove forests is a crocodile. And so it comes with a crocodile. But this is also true for soil systems. And the top predator for soil systems is a centipede. A brief foray into agriculture. A lot of the interventions that people have done for agriculture have been chemical interventions. You test the soil for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and you see what is missing. But a slightly harder approach, but a more organic approach, is if you could just study the soil ecosystems, you would know whether the soil is healthy or not. If the soil has enough organic matter, it will support enough wood lice, which eat organic matter, which would in turn support enough centipedes. So if you were to move the leaf litter, if you were to remove the mulch in an agricultural field, if there is mulch to begin with, of course, and you see a centipede, you know the soil is good. So that's a great heuristic. Another great heuristic to check if an ecosystem is healthy, your gut ecosystem, is to check the consistency of your feces. And this is a Bristol stool chart that somebody came up with, and it tells you if you are healthy or not based on your feces. So the concepts we've spoken of so far, one has been evolution. The other one is that life originated once. I think if a third concept can be added to this list, it would be symbiosis, which is organisms living alongside each other, which is what David Haskell's reading, The Forest Unseen, was about. So in this picture, cattle grazing, and the ecosystems you can think of are the soil ecosystems, which will ensure that the fodder is good and healthy and nutritious. And you have grazers grazing it. In an ideal world, you would also have a predator, like a wolf or a leopard, moving the cattle from place to place so that they don't overgraze. But another ecosystem, of course, is the gut biome of the cattle themselves. And this is a fascinating system because I'm sure you've heard of this as well, that if a cow can put on, or if a bull can put on muscle on just grass, why can't we? We can't because we don't have the same digestive system. Cattle have a 4-chambered stomach, which you can see here. And what the cow or the bull is actually doing is chewing all the grass, sending it in first. It gets mixed with digestive juices. It comes back out as cud to its mouth. It chews it again into a much finer paste, and then it sends it back. And now in its gut, there are anaerobic bacteria which cannot survive in the presence of oxygen, but they thrive in these acidic, oxygen-less places, and they digest the cellulose. And they free out the nutrients, which then the cattle can digest. So this is a great partnership, but what also happens is eventually these bacteria die and get digested themselves and also provide nutrition for the cattle. So almost all relationships in ecology are complex. There is no pure cooperation or there is no pure competition. Like even trees that compete with each other for sunlight are connected below ground through mycorrhizal fungi and will exchange nutrients and information with each other. So you compete with your friends and you cooperate with people you're competing with. So all life melds plunder and solidarity. And this is true at every level, just like we spoke about biodiversity, of how it's true for a forest, for a grassland, for soil, for microbiomes. This also is true for every aspect of life. This is a lichen. I'm sure many of you have seen it. If you haven't paid attention to it, I think this is a good season, especially if you are in South India, in Bangalore, where it's still raining. Just look on the trees around you and you will find lichen. It thrives when it's raining. The lichen is a really complex organism because it is a symbiosis between a fungi and an alga or bacterium. So the fungi provides the structure, the housing that protects this alga or bacterium, keeps it moist, protects it from radiation, from heat, all of that. And the bacteria or the alga, which is inside the fungi, produces food using photosynthesis. But this is true even for the very basic units of life, for a eukaryotic cell, for instance. So a prokaryotic cell has just DNA in it, but a eukaryotic cell. So if you're not familiar with biology, this is like the basic unit of life, of course. And a eukaryotic cell is a complex, slightly more complex cell than the simplest cell that is out there. And so a eukaryotic cell has what are called organelles, which are basically structures within the cell that perform specific functions. The DNA is housed within the nucleus, and these shapes that you see here are the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses which drive the cell, the engines of the cell. And some cells have chloroplasts, which help convert solar energy into food. And all of these organelles at some point used to be free living cells. They were free living solitary cells that got encapsulated but not digested. They got encapsulated and began to perform a function which the larger cell eventually could not do without. And so a partnership arose. And I think all life, from right from the cell to lichens, to how we exist, our gut biomes, cattle, to forests, is full of symbiosis like this, full of relationships that are very complex. And that, I think, is the third point that I would make after evolution, and that we are all connected through the origins of life. Yeah, so we are now at the half an hour mark. I still have 15 minutes, so I will go through the example of the fig wasp. This is perhaps, I think, my favorite example of in all of ecology. Figs are all trees like banyan, what people commonly call the rubber tree, and so all allied species. I'm not sure what else would, but in Hindi, like if Hindi names of trees, there's gular, there's pilkan, there is nevara. So all of these are called figs. And the way to tell if a fruit is a fig or if a tree is a fig, you take the fruit and you open it, and it does not have a single seed, but will have a cluster of very tiny seeds and will look something like this or like this. And you will never see this tree bear flowers like a peepal tree. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with a peepal tree or a banyan tree will never bear flowers. And yet it bears fruits. In biology, that at some point must have been a conundrum. Like, how can you get a fruit without a flower? Because it is only through the pollination of flowers that you can get fruits. But when you crack this fruit open, you realize that if it's unripe at some point, you can see structures that are like a flower. So you basically have encapsulated within this fig all the flowers. So it's a cluster of flowers encapsulated within a closed garden. But then how do they get pollinated? So you have a tiny wasp that's the size of a mosquito, which enters through a hole at the bottom. And it goes in because it wants to lay eggs inside the fig. That's the only place its babies can be born. So the wasp goes into the fig and lays eggs. But as it's doing this, it ends up pollinating the flowers because it's carrying pollen. We'll get in a moment to where it got the pollen from. But it goes in, it pollinates the flowers, lays eggs, and dies. Many wasps do this, and soon the fig is full of eggs. These hatch, and you get males and females. The males are born wingless and with large jaws, and the females are winged and will leave the fig at some point, but the males never do. So they mate and they will die inside the fig. The females will eventually leave, and as they're leaving, will pick up pollen from the fig. And they must go and find another fig to lay eggs in and will end up pollinating that fig. So each fruiting cycle of the fig tree is linked to one life cycle of the wasp. And this makes figs aseasonal, which is there is no particular season in which they will fruit. It makes them asynchronous, which means that no two fig trees will bear fruit at the same time. Like they don't necessarily need to bear fruit at the same time. They could, but they can also not. And what this enables them to do is that when in a forest there is no other food available, there's no tree fruiting, there will be a fig somewhere, aseasonally fruiting, which will provide food to everything that needs to eat and will keep the ecosystem going through this lean season. And so figs are called the keystone species. A keystone is the central stone in an arch, and if you remove the keystone, the arch would collapse. And at some point, people figured this out, or they knew this, because figs are sacred, right? And in every place I've been to, in every culture, every society, the cutting of figs is looked down upon, and peoples and banyans are worshipped. And I suspect the reason is that people knew the importance of figs. So this is a really cool ecosystem, but like with every ecosystem, it is much, much more complicated than this simple cycle. So just a few complications that I will point out is that so the female wasp has to find a fig to lay eggs in. So it has to be able to smell a fig which is flowering. But another point is that these wasps that I spoke about are all pollinating wasps. So they enter the fig and they pollinate it. But the first level of complication arises right here is that there are some wasps that do not pollinate the fig, but lay eggs in it anyway. So these have really long ovipositors. These things are called ovipositors. And they can inject their eggs into the fig without entering it. So they don't pollinate it. So they're called parasitoid wasps. So they parasitize the fig and they can get away with it. But there is another level of complication, which is that there are ants. So this ant is called Ecophila. They live on trees, are quite fierce. And so if you see them, if you approach them and you try and touch them, they will bite you. Not only will they will bite you and then inject acetic acid onto the bite to make sure it really hurts you. And so these are carnivorous ants, and they wait on these figs for the wasps to arrive. They also know when the flowers are ready. They can smell it as well. They've hacked the signal. And so they wait on the figs, and as the wasps arrive, they get eaten. However, the cool thing is that the pollinating wasps that enter the fig tend to escape the ants, while the parasitoid wasps that are laying eggs from outside get eaten proportionately more. So it keeps the ecosystem in check. As if this wasn't enough, you can keep going deeper and deeper. There are nematode worms that infest these wasps. The first study that I came across many years ago said that these nematode worms as well need to get from fig to fig. So they should be more attracted to pollinating wasps that will enter a fig eventually. But later studies have shown that even these nematode worms get confused about whom to infest. and end up infesting the males and the females of the parasitoid wasps much more than they would if it was by pure chance. And we're not entirely sure of how that happens yet. But what does all of this have to do with ecological design or ecologically aware design? I'm just trying to tell you, give you a glimpse of how complicated ecosystems actually are. Ecosystems around us. Like I'm sure there's a fig tree very close to where you live. And all of this is going on that tree day after day. It's just that we don't realize that it's happening. And so if you can grasp the fact that ecologically, ecosystems are really complex and you cannot recreate them, but we have to work within them. And if something has gone wrong, instead of looking for solutions, we must try and see how we can go back to the ecosystem, bring back the functionality rather than going forward and creating more problems. But how then do you develop an ecologically aware design? What can you do? So one is you use the heuristics, two of which that I've mentioned in this presentation. One was biodiversity, use biodiversity to see if your ecosystem is functional. Second is to look at top predators. Centipedes in the soil are top predators, and so see if you have those. And so these are heuristics. These are basic rules of thumb, but you cannot have this for everything. You can, they will only take you so far. So then what do you do? And I think this takes me back to the discussion that Rajesh and I were having the other day during the session, which is that we then need to develop ourselves because our design is a manifestation of our awareness and our aesthetics. And so the only way to create ecologically aware design, I think, is to become ecologically aware. And the way you would, let me just change the picture since I'm going to talk just a few brief minutes. So how do you do that then? How do you become ecologically aware? And I think different people have different ways of getting into this. I'm currently attending a conference on conservation science in Bangalore that is full of ecologists, and each of those people study something different. But each of them have come to an understanding of ecology which is very similar to each other. So it doesn't really matter where you start. Like you could start with insects, you could start with birds, or you could start with just looking at the trees around you. And that could be your in on increasing your own ecological awareness. Because each of these things will lead you there. So I started with bird watching. So India has about 2,000 species of birds. And once you start watching birds, you want to go to places where you can see more of them, more species. And you realize that you're going to places that are more ecologically sound, where the ecosystems are functional. Like you first have to leave the purely urban concrete setting to go to a park. A park has more birds than an urban, concrete place. And then you realize that the edges of towns have more birds than the centers of towns, and that forests have more birds than the edges of towns. And that, I think, gives you an insight into what functional ecosystems are or what they look like. And that will eventually feed into your design. So let me close with this quote from a book called One Straw Revolution, which is about agriculture by Masanobu Fukuoka. He was a Japanese plant scientist who specialized in plant diseases. But at some point, he had the realization that we do not know enough. Like we need to be more humble. And so he went back to trying to do agriculture that was more ecologically sound. And he says, the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. And if I could just paraphrase this, I think the ultimate goal is like the perfection of human beings, I think involves becoming more ecologically aware. And what route you take to get there doesn't really matter as long as you begin to just look around you at the living things. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'll take a few questions, I think, now. Do you have any comments, Rajesh?
I guess the question is, of course, this ecological worldview where, I mean, if you think like a gut bacteria is what, let's say 1 nanometer-ish, right? So this, it's as much smaller than us as we are than the Earth, right? If you think about it. So
Yeah,
relative
yeah,
to a
yeah.
bacterium, we are the size of a planet.
Yes.
So I guess if we were to do this more than metaphorically, we would have to learn to think uh, in a much more complex systems way than we normally do, right? And you can see that, like even in a city where, let's say, you're only looking at the scale from, say, insects to buildings, it's very hard for us to keep all of those um, scales and variables and interactions in mind. I guess it's not a question as much as a reflection. How to actually be concretely ecological in the way we think,
No
right?
pun intended there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So if any of the participants have any questions, if you can just raise a hand or put it in the comments.
And the other thing I'd wanted, again, it's not a question as much as a reflection. What you had said that even, I mean, that there's no such thing as pure competition. I mean, we know studies that there are bacterial species of gut that, depending on the conditions,
Yeah.
will flip from one to the other, right? So it's
Yes.
not even
Yes.
that some species are permanent competitors and others are permanent collaborators. It's that,
Yeah.
yeah. So
And also
that's the other.
where they are, like as long as they're in the gut, they're cool.
Yes.
But if they
Yeah. If they cross
manage
the
to
lining.
infiltrate, yeah.
So,
And it's true for every place. It's true for, say, a plant like lantana. It's fine if it's in Europe, but it comes to India and goes invasive.
yeah.
So I don't think we have any. Oh, maybe the comments are off.
No,
Or
no,
do
the
we have
comments
any
are up.
comments? Okay,
Yeah.
cool, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we don't have
There's
any
one
questions.
observation that Jeet
Mhm.
has. I'm just going to read it.
Yeah, yeah,
It's sad to see that recently, in many places these days, fig and banyan tree roots are being concretized with cement to construct a flat ground for rest and ritual worship purposes. A few trees I had seen through my childhood seem to be degrading, dying of lately. I don't know how common it is, but yeah, it seems there should be a
yeah,
way to create a platform without doing it in concrete, right?
yeah.
That seems like a
That can,
doable problem, right? What could
yeah,
be a construction, a simple way to construct a platform without?
yeah. Something that would expand with the tree.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a question about AI, and this there cannot be any
There's also a
premeditated
comment.
design solutions. Yeah, as we cannot match the complexity of evolution, but can AI tech help out?
I think you should take this. What do you think?
I definitely think that machine learning and those kinds of techniques are good to reason with complexity. But here's the problem is that unless it is correct, because these techniques hallucinate, like what you don't want is for something that you believe is the right answer, but actually is wrong because the system is simulating that's not correct. So we would have to do this very carefully, would be my answer. But
So my quick another, I'll just add to that is that I I don't have much faith in AI when it comes to ecologically aware design. Like,
Mhm,
just say you wanted to herd sheep, right?
mhm.
You would need to know what it takes to herd sheep. You would need to know how a sheepdog does it. Like, even a human doesn't know how a sheepdog does it. So you would have to crack that as well. So yeah, I wouldn't put my money in it. But I could be totally wrong. I'm just an
Mhm.
ecologist. But there was another comment from Harshal,
Mhm.
said little negative, but such ecologically aware design suggests minimal interference with the existing ecosystems. So, do we end up resorting to primitive existence? I think not. I think we just have to minimize disturbance. If you can design around, like, we are part of ecosystems, right? We're just animals. Humans are animals. We just have to make sure that the kind of destruction we create is contained, like it's minimal. And I think if you can just use material that is biodegradable, if you can build with mud, for instance, instead of concrete, I'm not saying it's applicable to every scenario, but just an example. If you could, that is one step, right? Because mud will eventually just become soil. And so we have to just minimize impact. This is in an ideal world. I do not know how this will apply to an urban setting, but I think that would be the way to go about it. Like modern design and material that is can go back into the ecosystem.